Hey Kai, I'm excited to learn about the new custom logs feature in Tailpipe.
Custom logs are useful if you've got data that maybe Tailpipe doesn't have a plugin for yet, or just some custom log data from your own application that you want to use Tailpipe to visualize. Using the custom logs feature, you can configure the collection to pull in just the columns that you need and query it as you want to.
Sounds amazing. Let's see how it works.
So say I have some JSON-L logs. I want to use Tailpipe to ingest them without having to rely on a plugin being defined for those logs. So I can define a partition in the normal way with a table name and a partition name, and configure my source to point to where the files live and what the extension of the files are. But the difference here is I'm defining a table name here, which is not provided by a plugin. Instead, it corresponds to a table block that I've defined within the config. And this is where things get a bit more interesting. So for the table, we can specify what the format of the data is. Now, this is what's known as a format preset, which is provided by the core plugin. The format type is JSON-L, and there's a format name called default. That just means it's JSON-L data with no additional configuration. It's just a shortcut. And the other thing we need to do when configuring a custom table, we have to provide a means of getting a timestamp column. The TP timestamp column is required for all Tailpipe logs. So what we need to do is find a column in our source data that we can use as a timestamp column. So if we have a quick look at the JSON-L data, and we can see there's a column at timestamp, and that looks to me like a Unix epoch timestamp. It's actually in Unix milliseconds. So we're going to have to convert that into DuckDB timestamp format.
That's probably the trickiest thing of any of this is all of our logs are going to treat time and in a different way. So we need to standardize this in the DuckDB format, which is what Tailpipe is going to use, because date and time is hard.
Exactly, yeah. And there's a bunch of ways we can do that depending on the conversion we're doing. So if we want to convert from Unix epoch time into a DuckDB timestamp, there's a handy DuckDB function we can use called toTimestamp. And now because it's Unix milliseconds, we have to just do an additional divide by 1,000 because that function expects Unix seconds. And what we can do is we can just pass a transform in to the column definition just to say, in order to get this column, you need to apply this function. And it will then just build behind the scenes the query to apply that transform. And that will now populate our timestamp column. And that's all we need to do. So now we can collect this partition and we should see some data. So let's look at the data we've collected. I'll just run Tailpipe query. And let's inspect the table that we've just defined. So there we go. As you can see, it's pulled in a whole bunch of columns. Quite a number, actually.
That's a lot of data. Maybe we could trim it down a little bit.
Cool. So let's just select some, and we can see we have the data. Now what I'd like to do is cut down the fields that I'm getting in there. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't really care about. So what we can do is we can specify just those fields that we want to collect. If I add a map fields property, and I can pass a list of the fields that I want. You can also pass in wildcards there in case you want a bit more flexibility. I also know there's a column called _document ID. I'd like that to come through as the column document ID. I'd like to map the name. So what I can do is I can add another column definition, and I can say the source column is _document ID, and then the column name that we're actually going to get in our data is document ID. So what we should do now is we should get these fields mapped through and then these additional fields that we've added in. So let's save that. We'll collect again. Okay, we'll go back into Tailpipe query. And if we now inspect it, you can see we've just got the fields we defined. We've got document ID. And we also have this whole bunch of TP fields. They will always come through. We provide these fields to make it easy to join between different Tailpipe tables. So there's a common set of columns that get populated. And so now if we take a look, we've got a lot less data in there and just the columns that I care about.
So we talked about these TP fields, which are these common Tailpipe fields. And we probably want to be specific about, because again, the log's not going to know what TP user should be, for example, which we might want to be able to join based on that from some other tables that we have from other plugins or other sources, right?
That's it. So some of these fields get automatically populated. As I mentioned before, TP timestamp you have to specify in your config, but the TP date field gets automatically populated from the timestamp. You know, the partition field, the table field, the source type field. There's a few things that we know that Tailpipe is able to automatically populate, but then all the other ones, the table definition needs to populate. So if we wanted to populate the TP usernames, we could do that by just adding in another column definition. Okay, so to populate the TP usernames column, we can just define another column in our table. And I know that in this log data, there's 3 columns that all might contain usernames: actor, user, and owner. And so again, I can use a DuckDB transform to construct an array from those columns. So let's go and collect that data.
Yeah. So the reason that we're running a collect again is because you just changed the schema by adding this new field mapping and transform, right?
Exactly. So we want to force it to recollect all the data that we've got with the new schema. Okay, so we've redone the collection. I'm going to go back into Tailpipe Query and let's take another look at what we got. I'm going to select the usernames column, and I'm hoping now we've got some data in there. And we do, except that we've got a load of nils as well. So that transform we're doing, clearly some of the source columns don't always have data in. So we could be a little bit more clever on that transform, just to avoid the nils. So
yeah, let's get clever.
So we can put this slightly more complex transform in. Just going to filter the list values, excluding the null ones and getting the distinct values. That should give us the results that we want. One more collection. And let's see how that looks now. Much better.
Look how clever. So this is really great. This, you know, we can see the power that we have of doing complex things fairly easily in this case, and, you know, using that DuckDB transform. Now, you talked about how this is using a built-in format with JSON-L. What do we do if we have a log format that's not one that Tailpipe already understands, like JSON-L, the ones that have the default presets?
Sure. So we have the ability to parse custom log lines which don't fit one of our standard formats by defining a regex format. So I've got another config here which will actually read custom logs from a file which requires the log lines to be parsed. I'll talk through the different sections. So the partition is as before. We define a new table name, mysyslog. And again, we have a source configuration pointing to a slightly different location. And this time the file layout is .log files. But apart from that, it's all totally standard. I've got my table definition. And you'll note here, I've got a different format. I've got format.regex.example. Now, this is not a format which a plugin provides. This is a format which we define within the config. And it's a format of type regex, which means we can specify a regex pattern, and we use that pattern to parse the log lines. So that is defined down here. And here we have the regex that we can use to parse the log lines. It's got named capture groups. So what this is going to do is pull out a timestamp field, host, service, PID, level, and message. Now, as we mentioned before, we have to specify where the TP timestamp comes from. And we know that this format is going to pull out a timestamp field. So we can set that as the source field for the TP timestamp column. So why don't we just try and collect this and see how it looks. So I'm going to collect the data from my custom syslog table that I've just defined. And there we go. And we can just have a quick look at that. And we'll now see there's 2 tables, my GitHub and my syslog. So we'll select from that one. And there we go.
There they are. That's super exciting. Kai, this stuff is really cool. I love the ability to create, bring in log files in any way that we need them. We don't have to wait for there to be a plugin. We don't have to create a plugin. It's no plugin, no problem. Thanks for sharing this with us today. I'm really, really excited to see what people do with this.
My pleasure. Me too.
Thanks for watching, everybody. If you are ready to get started with Tailpipe, you'll find more information and a getting started guide at tailpipe.io.